Clallam Conservation, and I'm going to be leading the workshop this evening. It looks like we have a pretty small group. So what I'm going to suggest is if you have questions during the presentation, feel free to just submit them using the chat box. Should be down on the bottom of your screen. It has a little bubble. And we will be keeping an eye on the chats as they come in and periodically trying to stop and answer questions as we go. My coworker, Megan Ademeyer, is also kind of behind the scenes helping out with this. So she's gonna help me keep track of the time and the chat and questions as they come in. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. So thanks for joining us on our wintertime management of poultry. And we wanted to start out by just talking a little bit about who we are and what we do. So for those of you who don't know, we're Clallam Conservation District, and conservation districts are nationwide grassroots organizations. And we work on conserving natural resources, a variety of natural resources such as soil, water quality, plants. We do a lot of habitat work. And we help farmers and land users come up with plans for protecting natural resources on their properties. All of our services are non-regulatory and they are all free. We are grant funded, so we do a lot of work with grants and getting grant funding to help farmers and landowners make improvements to their property. We have a lot of information on our website, so I'd encourage you to go ahead and check our website out. A lot of information on our various programs on the website, and kind of you can get a better feel for who we are and what we do. With that, we're going to go ahead and move into the actual presentation. And again, as we're going along, if you have questions, feel free to just pop those into the chat box. Okay, let's go ahead and get started here.
A lot of times we have this kind of vision of what it will be like to keep chickens in this very nostalgic, collecting our eggs daily and just this like peaceful country activity. And oftentimes the reality of keeping chickens in Clallam County looks a little bit more like this. So of course, this is somewhat seasonal. And Megan and I do routinely go out and visit with folks on their properties throughout the county. And we've come to learn that chickens are really popular. Poultry is a really popular livestock and kind of overlooked. And so we were hoping by pulling together this presentation that we can help your winter poultry keeping activities be a little bit more like the previous slide and not like this current slide. So of course, when you're dealing with muddy poultry houses and muddy pens, you also have just messy birds. If you have layers and you have muddy areas, oftentimes when your hens are hopping up into their nesting boxes, they're transferring that mud and grime on their feet onto the eggs. It's just a slippery, dangerous footing for you to deal with. The poultry that are kind of kept in these muddy pens and houses, they often have lower body temperatures, which makes them more susceptible to disease and infection and some foot diseases. And then runoff from these muddy, manure-filled poultry pens can cause problems for wells, nearby wells, and for surface and groundwater. So it's pretty important to try to improve these areas, not only for the health of your bird, but also for the health of water and wells in your area. So this evening, we're just going to talk a bit more about some tips on keeping poultry during the winter. I'm going to talk more about coops and houses and the importance of ventilation. We're going to talk a bit about nesting boxes for those of you that have layers. Power, so we get a lot of questions about lights and heat lamps and water heaters. And there's some basic poultry keeping things like food and water, perching, bedding. We're going to talk a bit in more detail about outdoor yards and manure and litter management. So what we've learned throughout our time working in this county is that there's really a variety of techniques and kind of approaches to keeping poultry. And so what we found is that poultry are very adaptable. They can kind of thrive and live in a variety of different keeping styles and farm setups. But usually folks either have a permanent situation where you have a poultry house or a shed with an attached pen, or some sort of portable structure, like a chicken tractor tend to be popular. Some folks are just simply keeping a free range flock. And then a lot of times it's a combination of the above 3 types of poultry keeping styles. So I just want to briefly run through these and how they relate to winter management. So the more traditional permanent setup where you have a house, a designated house, this provides safe, secure housing. Once you've got the structure in, it's typically minimal labor to keep it going. It's a little bit easier for folks to step in and take care of poultry setups like this. And the big thing that I'm going to talk a bit more about tonight is those sorts of permanent houses are a lot easier for you to winterize. Of course, there's some considerable cost in getting these poultry houses established. It does require routine maintenance of the outdoor pen, which we'll talk more about, to reduce mud. And it doesn't give the poultry a lot of fresh ground and fresh insects. Sometimes they get a little mopey, especially if they're used to free ranging around when they're locked in this sort of setup. So these are just a few examples of what a more permanent structure looks like. So you've got your house and it's secure, you've got an attached pen or run. And for the most part around here, it's necessary to cover that run to help with hawk and eagle predation, and also to keep birds from flying out. So these are just a couple different examples. We've seen all sorts of permanent structures where someone's, salvaged an old woodshed on their property, or an old trailer. So there's a variety of options. So the next thing I want to briefly mention is portable poultry keeping, and these tend to be pretty affordable. The nice thing about this setup is you can move it around your farm and your property, which will help kind of reduce the bare mud spots that chickens love to create. And it does provide more fresh grass and vegetation and insects for the chickens. Again, there is a cost for developing these sorts of structures. It does require routine maintenance, and it does not, it's a little hard to get food and water. And the main thing is it's harder to winterize this sort of setup. It can be done, but it is a bit more challenging. And so then a lot of folks kind of adapt to this combination of a permanent and portable setup. And so this provides both predator and weather protection, and the fresh grass and insects that the poultry tend to like. But it does, again, require moving things around and requiring maintenance on 2 separate structures. So here's just a couple examples of some more portable setups here. We find that these work better for the spring and summer and fall months when the weather isn't quite as severe and the days are longer. So going out and moving these things around seem a little bit easier to do. Some of these, like the bottom left-hand picture with that cute turquoise cabinet door, those do provide a more winterized house that could be used. So that could be a permanent setup. It's pretty small, and managing that outdoor pen can be challenging too, just to try to get bedding in there if you're not moving it on a regular basis. These are more portable structures. I've seen folks are so creative coming up with ideas to move these portable structures around their property. So it could be an old pop-up trailer, an old horse trailer that can be moved around. The challenge is the pen, and I really liked that flatbed example because everything goes. The pen goes, the shed goes. You would need a tractor or a pickup truck or something along those lines to move it, but that does seem to be a pretty clever setup if you really don't have a more permanent designated poultry house and pen. But regardless of what you pick, whether it's a permanent house or a trailer, it's really important that you have proper ventilation. So poultry produce water vapor and ammonia and heat continuously. So coops need to be well ventilated all the time, day and night, throughout the winter. So a general rule of thumb is about 1 square foot of ventilation per 10 square feet of coop floor space. In cold climates, you should make sure that the vents are well above the chicken's head, so higher is better, and also make sure that you have some protection where the snow is not going to block the ventilation. The more I read up on this, I knew ventilation was a key thing, but I didn't really realize the impact of poor ventilation on poultry health until I started preparing for this webinar this evening. So definitely make sure that whatever you're using for your house, that you can get some fresh air moving through there. It seems a little counterintuitive to us that want to make sure our poultry aren't cold, but it turns out that they're pretty good about staying warm, and they will thrive in a cold environment. But where they start to have a lot of problems is if you don't have good ventilation when they're confined in these houses. So the next thing I want to mention are nesting boxes. So for those of you that have layers, and layers tend to be probably the more predominant type of poultry that folks keep in Clallam County. Obviously, if you've ever had farm fresh eggs, you know why they're such a delight when compared to store eggs. So there's some things that you can do to just try to make this part of chicken keeping a bit easier. With your nesting boxes, you want to bed with hay, straw, or some sort of wood shavings or wood chips. You should avoid like sawdust, that very fine kind of dusty material, because that can cause some respiration problems in hens. These nesting boxes, you want to routinely clean these areas. Chicken can carry lice, and like I mentioned, the hens like to get down and peck around, and they're going to get dirty and then jump up in these nesting boxes and transfer that dirt and manure with them. So it's good to try to keep the boxes as clean as possible. Your nesting boxes should be elevated off the ground, and you need to provide some sort of access ramp or a perch or some way for the hens to easily access the nesting boxes. I've seen some really cool, creative ways of making very inexpensive nesting boxes by using old drawers, an old desk. I found that one picture of some old buckets that seem to work really well. The main thing is just try to make it easy for the birds to get in and out, and also easy for you to be able to routinely clean out these boxes. So I want to talk a bit about light, which if you're keeping laying birds, they need about 12 hours of daylight to continue laying throughout the winter. So some people go ahead and decide that they don't want to deal with artificial light on their layers, and so they just realize that you're going to have a reduction, or even they might quit laying eggs altogether for a while. But if you want to keep those birds laying throughout the winter months, you need to get a system in to provide at least 12 hours of daylight. You can use, a variety of bulb types, but you want to be aware that this is a dusty environment, and try to set up a system where it's easy for you to regulate with a dimmer switch and with a timer. So if you're using a fluorescent bulb, it's important to use a warm wavelength bulb, and it appears more yellow and orangish or reddish in color. And that kind of stimulates the chicken's reproductive cycle, so that's going to keep them laying more. The low wattage light bulbs, like usually a 24 to 40 watt bulb, is plenty for providing the light necessary for the hen to encourage the hens to continue to lay. You can also use LED lights. The glassless design is kind of ideal if you end up having a situation where you break a light bulb. So if you do opt to add artificial light for the purpose of stimulating laying production throughout the winter, you want to slowly increase the supplemental lighting. We're getting ready to our days are definitely getting shorter right now. So this would be the time to get one of these systems, get a timer that will help you control the lights. Ideally, you want to add the extra lighting in the early mornings. And so rather than adding the light to the end of the day, the hens seem to do better with an early morning light, artificial light. You want to be very careful that you make sure that the bulbs and the cords are elevated off the ground and protected from the birds, and that you're not getting an accumulation of straw or hay or shavings kind of in the area, because that can be a fire danger for sure. So there's a lot of, I just included a few pictures. If you go to any kind of home improvement store or any farm and garden store, there's a lot of different timers and light styles out there. Some are fairly inexpensive, and you can certainly go up from there as far as timing and control. So yeah, it's a cool way to keep hens laying during the winter. Plus, it does make going out and doing your chores a little bit easier if you're not having to go out and do it in the pitch blackness that we often get in the winter months here. Another thing we get a lot of questions about is heat, and should I be heating my poultry house? For the most part, like I mentioned earlier, birds are pretty resilient. They obviously have feathers, which helps keep them warm. And the main thing is not necessarily so much heating them, but keeping them dry and kind of out of snow and drafts. And so if you have a secure poultry house, with a good roof, so you're not getting a lot of leaks or anything like that, then it's probably not necessary to add heat for adult birds. Now, if you have young birds or obviously chicks, they're certainly going to need some sort of heat lamp during the winter months. So if you do opt for adding a heating device, you need to be very careful that you have everything protected, that you're using an appropriate bulb, not just a light, but an actual heat bulb. And they should be installed so that the devices and wires leading to them are protected from contact with the poultry. I have at least one friend who had a small barn fire that originated from a poorly placed heat lamp. And I have a couple of friends that are firefighters that say they routinely deal with outbuildings and fires that are a result of heat lamps that are not properly installed. So it is a considerable danger. If you keep birds, you know that they are curious creatures and they like to fly around and bump into things. So you really need to put a lot of thought into making sure that whatever system, if you do decide to proceed with a heat lamp, that it is safe and not going to cause a potential fire. So another thing that our birds need are roosts. And this is pretty important, especially in the winter time, because they naturally want to roost up and sleep off the ground. If the ground is cold, they can get frostbite on their feet. So they need to be able to properly roost. It should be, 1.5 to 3 feet high. They really tend to prefer a multi-leveled approach. So in the photo here, there's just some examples of just sticks or large diameter sticks that were collected kind of out in the woods that have been installed to provide a variety of roosting heights. But the thing to keep in mind is that each bird needs about 8 to 10 inches of horizontal space on the perch. So make sure that you have enough perch length to accommodate all of your birds. There's a hierarchy within poultry, and usually the newer birds added to the flock tend to be kind of lower in the social status, and those will be the first to get kind of kicked off a perch that's crowded. So you just want to make sure that your birds all have an area that they can get up off of the ground in the evenings and sleep. Where you place the perch is pretty critical. You're going to have the largest accumulation of manure under the perches. So of course, don't put the perches above your nesting boxes or your feeding areas. I would put a perch and install it in such a way that it's pretty easy to get a rake or a manure fork under the perch and to clean that area. Wood is really the best. Kind of avoid using metal, which can get really cold and cause frostbite, or plastic, which can kind of degrade over time and cause some problems for their feet. So really, wood is your best material for constructing a perch. So providing feed for your poultry, you're going to need to feed more during the winter months, just like with about any type of livestock. They're spending more calories to try to keep warm, so you're going to have to increase their feed amount. Most folks that I know offer a free choice feed for their poultry, which tends to work really well. But just make sure that whatever you're feeding, it's designed for your poultry type. So what you would be feeding your laying hens is likely a different mix than what you'd be feeding your meat birds or your turkeys. So kind of think about that. The best option is to put complete feed in some sort of poultry feeder. And here's a couple examples of poultry feeders that are available, again, through online or through any of the local farm and garden stores. You need to provide scratch and grit just to aid with digestion. And they tend to like to have that actually on the ground so they can scratch around and keep themselves busy. But do take into consideration that chicken feed, especially laying hens, tend to attract rodents. So be aware of that. The less feed spillage you have, the less likely you're going to have a rodent problem. But a lot of hen houses do routinely have problems with rats and rodents, so just kind of be aware of that. Definitely excess feed needs to be, or your extra feed needs to be stored in a metal container with a lid to help discourage rodents, and try to, rodent proof your houses and your pens as best as possible. So the next thing I want to talk a little bit more about is water. So poultry cannot hydrate from ice or snow. They have to have liquid water available. So it's critically important that you have water available pretty much all the time for your birds. This can be challenging when we get those really cold snaps where we've got, a few weeks of temperatures that are well below freezing. So there's some options out there for heated things like a heated dog bowl. I've used a heated pet bowl in my hen house before, and it works really well. The one thing, of course, the hens, just being the hens, they wanted to mess with the cord a little bit. So I actually just found an old piece of hose, and I ran the cord through the hose. That way they couldn't come directly in contact with the actual cord. I've used the red Poultry-Fowl. That's what I normally water my chickens out of, and it is fabulous. They learn how to use it very easily. It's very easy to clean. However, you can buy heated ones, which that's the one challenge. The one I had wasn't heated, so it was a little bit hard to keep their water liquid and available. But you can try. I've had folks say that they've had luck with putting ping pong balls in like chicken troughs to help keep the ice from forming, but probably in those really cold temperatures, you're going to need to look at doing some sort of heated water for your poultry. So the next thing I want to talk a bit about are the litter and the bedding. And so the litter is just the material that's typically on the ground in the hen house. And so this is kind of where diligence and routine management really comes into play during the winter months. So what I usually recommend is that folks use what's called a deep litter or a deep bedding method. There is a lot of information out on the internet about how to do this. But basically, you're going to start with at least 6 inches of some sort of dry material. I personally like straw because it's readily available. It's easy to transport. You can buy it at any of the feed stores, throw a bale in the bed of your truck and have it right there near your hen house. But you're going to want to, spread out the straw, fluff it up about 6 inches to start with. And then you're going to need to routinely go in there with a pitchfork or a hay fork and kind of fluff that top area. You'll see over time the hens will kind of smash down the bedding, and there'll be a lot of manure deposited on top. But if you routinely go in there and kind of fluff that, what it'll do is it'll drop the manure down towards the bottom of the floor and then leave dry material on the top. So you're going to need to periodically add more straw or whatever you pick as a substrate on the bottom. to kind of keep that 6 inches and to keep the hens up above that kind of dirty layer that's underneath. And then in the spring, or it may need to be done more frequently depending on how big your shed is and how many birds you have in there, but you'll want to completely clean out the area. We'll talk a little bit more about what to do with that material clean out of there, but this deep bedding method is just a way of kind of dropping the wet soiled bedding and manure to the bottom of the hen house while providing a dry, fluffy top layer for them to hang out in during the winter months. So the benefits of using this sort of method is that it does, if you do it right, it's not something that's smelly or stinky. It reduces a lot of flies. It makes the coop a much more attractive area. It keeps your birds clean, so their feet are clean and your eggs tend to be cleaner. It gives them something to do. You'll see they'll be in there scratching around and throwing that bedding around, but it keeps them happy and busy. And it saves you work because you're not in there every couple days completely stripping out an area and adding new bedding. Where things go wrong with this method, like I mentioned, is it does require consistent management. So you really do need to do your best to try to keep things dry. So if you've got a leaky roof, get in there right away and fix that leaky roof, because if this area gets wet, it does get stinky, kind of things go anaerobic, and your hens are not going to be as happy. So dry is key, and then, kind of constantly fluffing it and adding that fresh bedding is also key throughout the county. So
we're going to pause for just a moment and just try to grab a few questions that may be coming up. I know that's a lot of information very quickly. So Dan had a question on thoughts on using wood pellets for bedding. Is it similar to those used in horse stalls? So yeah, and we'll get into a little bit more about bedding. The wood pellets for horse stalls, you want to usually add a little bit of moisture to that to try to kind of fluff it out. So I'm not sure how successful the wood pellets would be, but it is an option you could kind of play around with. I have seen them used kind of in the outdoor pens a little bit better. The risk you run with the wood pellets is that if they get, they're very fine, so they get kind of absorb up a lot of water. But yeah, if you got them slightly damp, they probably work really well for bedding. Any other questions? You can feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question, or feel free to type it in the chat box.
So if you are really wanting to tackle creating a permanent outdoor poultry yard that is mud free, then I'd suggest you follow the steps here on this slide. So, first thing, make sure you don't have any surface water coming into the area. Ideally, you want about a 2% slope. You can have one that's a little bit greater, but you want to slope the area so you're shedding water away from your coop or your hen house. If you're in a very poorly drained area, it's not a bad idea to install geotextile fabric on the base. And so this is road building cloth. It's heavy duty. It's what they use underneath logging roads. And you're going to put gravel footing on top of that. And so we recommend using a perimeter. You can use old railroad ties or even old fence posts, but basically you're going to make a sandbox, which you're then going to backfill with some sort of footing. We typically recommend 5/8 - so this is crushed gravel that you would kind of fill in that sandbox area. And what that does is that basically raises the whole elevation of your birds above the natural ground layer. It gives water a chance to run off and then hopefully keep mud and down while keeping your chickens up. So because poultry, and I'll talk a little bit more about just their unique nature of their manure, but it is very high in nutrients and bacteria. And so there is going to be runoff that comes off of this mud-free pen during the winter months. We're going to get rain. That rain has to go somewhere. And when it washes off of your poultry yard, it washes all the nutrients and the bacteria as well. So it's pretty important that you leave a very grassy filter strip kind of on all sides of your chicken pen, especially the down slope side. I strongly recommend you to locate your poultry pens at least 200 feet away from your own groundwater. As I mentioned, chicken poultry manure is very high in nitrogen. And so if you're on especially very well-drained soils, and you have a lot of poultry manure, the nitrates can run off down into your well water. So try to put these pens as far away from your well as possible. And also do not locate them near a stream or a ditch or a pond, because again, the same concern with runoff coming off of these areas. Try to direct all that runoff into a grassy filter strip area. So let's see here. Okay. So again, so you're wanting to divert surface water away. The next time it rains really hard, which probably won't be in too much time, take a walk around your chicken area, see where the water's coming from and what you can do to try to intercept that water and keep it away from your house and your yard. It's really hard for Megan and I to give recommendations about drainage kind of in one of these webinars. It's very site specific, but you know, do take a look at your topography, kind of the natural drainage of where this goes. You know, in our county, you need to keep your drainage water on your own property. So just kind of running it onto the neighbor's property is not an ideal scenario. So if you need help with drainage systems, you know, you can chat with us more. We can kind of give you some recommendations, but the key is just to keep clean water out of this area. An easy way to deal with that is making sure you have a good roof runoff system on your poultry or hen house. So strongly recommend you install gutters and downspouts on your building. Even if you have it set up where it's a shed style roof and that roof water is draining kind of on the opposite side of the poultry pen, what will happen is when we get those big rain events, a lot of times that roof water will still somehow make it into the house or make it into the pen. So the best thing to do is just put a gutter and a downspout on that building and then outlet that downspout either into a dry well or somewhere where it's not going to cause a problem for your poultry or any other livestock that you might have. Basically, you want to keep clean roof water out of these poultry yards, which are not clean. And you know, it's even a small shed can generate a lot of water. So 1,000 square foot roof, if you have 1 inch of rain on that, that's 625 gallons. So now figure out what the rainfall is in your area, and that's a lot of water that's coming off of a roof. So again, talking about these permanent pens, if we're going to assume that you have a mucky, poorly drained site, here's kind of just a quick diagram of what I talked about in the first slide, the native soil material, a layer of geotextile fabric, and then 6 inches of 5/8- packed gravel. So this is kind of your Cadillac system if you really want to get your chickens up above the native ground and keep them out of the mud. So then a couple different things. If it's really not that bad and you just have maybe a little skiff of mud on the top that makes the birds dirty and the eggs dirty, then you can look at some other sorts of footing that you can use to kind of cover up the bare ground. Anytime you have bare ground, and if you have chickens or any sort of poultry confined in an area, you will most certainly have bare ground in a matter of days, actually. But you're going to want to cover that bare ground. Bare ground is where you start having the mud problems. And so, as I mentioned earlier, you can use wood. I like the hog fuel, the large diameter chipped wood. I mentioned I'm not a big fan of sawdust. I don't think it just doesn't have the structure to hold up in our sort of climate. It might work well in more drier climates, but I just don't think it works well outdoor in our climate. Sand can be used, shavings. Again, I like the larger diameter. You can use things like straw. If you have old hay or old straw, and you go out there and kind of layer it up, but this is more than just like 1 inch or 2. You want to put like several inches, half a foot of straw or old hay down. That will help. Your goal is basically to cover up the bare ground and get those birds up above the native soil. So I'm just going to quickly run through kind of the pros and cons of these different footing options. So again, I like the chips or the hog fuel. I think that it binds up the nitrogen well, so it's not as stinky, so it can help with odor issues. And you can compost it and use it as mulch later. Again, you know, you need several inches of this, and it's not a real permanent solution. It will break down over time, and you will have to add more to it. So someone mentioned sand earlier, and sand does work well too. You know, you can rake, you know, use like a leaf rake or something to kind of rake manure up off the top, or use a manure fork to kind of try to keep the surface as clean as possible. The birds naturally like using it for dusting and during the summer, actually during the winter months too. It's a good option if your soil is well drained. So if you've just had a little skiff of mud in your poultry yards in the past, sand might work great for you. If you've got ponded water and it's really squishy, then I would encourage you to consider a gravel base. And you could top coat it with sand, but I would not use sand as your sole footing. So again, you're going to need several inches of it. It will, you know, you're going to need to clean it on a pretty regular basis. It doesn't do much for odor control. So if you're not good about cleaning it, it can get a bit stinky, and it tends to be a little bit more expensive than the wood products. So here's just some examples of using straw or hay. Again, that's inexpensive. It's easy to spread. It does help kind of bind up the nitrogen smell. The thing I do like about straw and hay versus like wood chips or hog fuel is it does compost much quicker. The carbon content's much smaller, so it breaks down a lot quicker. If you're using like the wood chips or the hog fuel, when you get to the point that it's so soiled, you need to clean it out. It's going to take some pretty active management to get that to compost down into a more usable product, unless you just plan on using it as mulch somewhere on your property. The drawbacks to using straw or hay is, again, if you have a naturally wet spot, it doesn't really do much for you. It can get pretty soggy, and this is something that you need to frequently add out in your pen. So it's not just like a once a month sort of thing. It's like a weekly or sometimes even daily sort of bedding. So we see a lot of portable poultry yards, which are awesome. Birds love it because it gives them access to fresh greens. It's nice because it can help reduce the odor. It's just not very practical during the winter months. If you've ever moved this poultry netting, it's not as easy as one would think. And it doesn't hold up well to snow, drifting snow, or wind. And it can be a challenge to keep it electrified. And, you know, there are some predation concerns too. Obviously, hawks can easily come in and out of these areas. But it is an option, I'd say more of an option during the nicer weather than it is during winter time. Okay, so I mentioned earlier I was going to talk about some other poultry types, and so I want to just talk a bit about turkeys. I've kept turkeys before. I love keeping turkeys. I think they're great. Some people don't agree, but the one thing to know is that you should not keep turkeys and chickens together. They need to be separated. There's a disease that can pass between the birds that can be pretty problematic. That being said, there's lots of stories out there, and I read into lots of people who successfully keep them together without a problem, but the general recommendation is not to keep them together. Most turkey breeds can handle cold weather once they reach maturity. I think the heritage breeds tend to do better than the more commercial breeds, and that's kind of not just for winter keeping. The heritage breeds just tend to be a little easier and more adaptable than the commercial breeds. It's pretty important that you provide a roost for the birds, and those roosts need to be large enough that they can get their feet completely covered. So because turkey are larger birds, they need like a 4-inch, you know, width to stand on. And so the 2x4s tend to be the easiest thing to create their perches, and that just provides them with enough space to ensure that they can cover their feet. Their feet are pretty prone to frostbite. And a simple thing, and you could probably do this actually with chickens too, but adding corn to their diet can help them, it just increases their calories and helps them keep a bit warmer during the cold nights. So waterfowl, I briefly mentioned waterfowl earlier during the question and answer section, but again, they need a secure predator-proof house or coop. And again, it needs to be well ventilated, and this is the same for turkeys as well. Because the waterfowl don't roost at night like the chickens and turkeys do, they need extra bedding in their house. Straw really works well. You can use sawdust inside too, but they will have frostbite on their feet if they don't have a warm surface that they can stand on. So it's pretty important to keep their houses well bedded. As I mentioned earlier, they absolutely have to have thawed water at all time because of how they digest food. So it's pretty critical that you ensure you come up with a system to ensure that they have water, whether you use a heated pan. It is challenging. It's kind of like keeping pigs. They like to play in water too, and waterfowl are no exception. So weighting down a bowl or a trough to help keep them from, flipping it over and turning it over. Again, I would strongly recommend you provide feed and water outside of the house, or you're going to be constantly stripping out wet bedding all the time. And again, some sort of stall mat or a gravel pad or something to put the water and food on, I think will really help out. I also want to mention that they don't like this idea, but they don't actually need swimming water during the winter months. It just gets really challenging trying to manage their kind of swimming areas. So although they might be disappointed, it's not necessary for them to have a pool or a pond to swim in during the winter months. The other thing I'll mention too on waterfowl is that domestic waterfowl, so domestic ducks and geese, can really impact water quality of natural ponds and streams. We've done a lot of water quality studies, and we have found that folks that keep like large flocks of not even large flocks, even small flocks of domestic ducks and geese in natural streams and ponds with outlets, that can significantly cause problems with water quality. So I would encourage you, if you want to keep ducks, they're so friendly, amazing. Same with geese. I would encourage you to not let them have access to natural water features on your property. Instead, give them the kiddie pool or something else, a trough or something to play in. So lastly, I want to talk a bit more about manure. If you've kept chickens, you realize right away they eat more than you think they should eat, and they create a lot more manure than you think that is possible for something that size. So one chicken's producing about 1/3 pound of manure every day. That's 8 to 11 pounds per month per bird. So that high volume of that is moisture. So about 80% of it is moisture. So it does dry out to be a smaller amount. But as I mentioned earlier, that manure is really high in nitrogen and phosphorus. And the manure oftentimes does contain when we're cleaning out the houses and stuff, it does have the dry carbon material and bedding from the litter. So you hear people say chicken manure, poultry manure is hot, and this is what you're talking about. So if you're looking at the pounds of nutrient in like a ton of chicken manure compared to a ton of beef manure, you can see that N there, which is nitrogen, is incredibly high. It's 27.3 pounds of nitrogen per ton. And same with if you slide over to P2O5, that's the phosphate. So that's, again, a very high level. So this is kind of just wanted to show this so you understand when people are talking about manure, chicken manure being hot, or this is what they're talking about. It's high in these nutrients. Great thing for increasing soil fertility. You have to be really careful with how you use it. And that is why I kind of have a couple slides on how to manage the poultry manure and the litter. So if you're cleaning the houses, I especially recommend cleaning the nest boxes on a regular basis. You're going to want to have a pile somewhere. Maybe you have a compost bin or a manure storage structure, but at a minimum, you're going to want to pile this material up during the winter, and you're going to want to cover it with a tarp. The tarp keeps the rainwater from mixing with the manure and the bedding and running off. Remember I mentioned that runoff can leach down into groundwater and cause problems. Plus, there's good nutrients in that manure that might be valuable for you to help improve your pastures or help improve your gardens. So you want to keep that manure pile tarped. You want to make sure, just like with your poultry pens, that you have a vegetated filter strip around the manure pile. Make sure there's not water near or running through the manure pile. And especially with poultry manure, because it is so high in nutrients, it's not a bad idea if you have a concrete area where you can store it on a concrete slab. That is really ideal. So we do recommend that you compost poultry manure and litter before using it, and that kind of helps stabilize things. And so because and I'll talk a little bit more about composting, but you're going to definitely want to add some carbon material to the manure. Ideally, you already have it there because you're cleaning out your straw bedded poultry house. But you need to ensure the composting process is complete before you use this material on your gardens, especially if you're feeding a high protein diet like a meat diet. That will even increase the amount of nitrogen in the chicken manure more than if it's a vegetarian diet. So I'm just going to run through composting very quickly. We have a lot more information on our website. WSU Extension can provide you with a lot more information on composting. But basically, you have these microorganisms that are working to break down the organic components of the manure and bedding. And these little critters are not unlike the critters you keep, like chickens or livestock. They need oxygen. So that's coming into turning the pile. You can put PVC pipes in and help encourage airflow. Those little critters need moisture. They need water, just like your chickens. So a lot of times, like I mentioned, the chicken manure is already very wet, so you might not need to add moisture, but your compost pile should be about as wet as a wrung out sponge. You need dry material. So again, you have to kind of mess around with the combination, but you're going to need to use more straw or carbon material with composting chicken manure than you would, like, say, with horse manure. The nitrogen's the green manure, so that's the poultry waste. And then you're going to need heat for this process to happen. Again, keeping the pile covered with a tarp will help generate heat. And then the time it's going to take is really going to vary, 6 to 8 weeks, possibly longer. So when you have finished compost, it's a more stable product to use, and it reduces the volume quite a bit. So slow release fertilizer, excellent soil amendment. Here's just a couple examples of different composting structures. You can get creative out there with how you kind of develop these composting areas, but it is good to designate an area. And so that finally brings us to the last slide. Megan and I routinely make farm visits.
Okay, so that kind of wraps up the PowerPoint section of the presentation. So I thought we could just kind of go over, I've been trying to answer questions in the chat as they come up. So I think that what we can do is just kind of go over a few questions. I just had a question on the cost of a bale of straw. And I have to be honest, it's been a while since I've purchased straw. I would imagine, and I'm gonna, ask Megan too, my coworker. I would imagine that the cost has gone up significantly as kind of everything has with hay. So I would bet that it would be, depending on the weight of a bale of straw, upwards of at least $15 a bale. I'm not sure if anybody else that's on the webinars purchased straw. Oh, Paula just mentioned that a bale of straw at Coastal right now is around $12 a bale. So I'd say check with the local feed stores. A lot of it just depends if there's road work going on in the area. A lot of times they'll order in large quantities of straw, and then it'll be a little bit more affordable and available. But yeah, it looks like the going rate, at least at the Coastal store and Swim, is $12 a bale. So I'm just going to pull up the chat question. There was a question about hens not kind of slowing down production and not laying. And I know in the presentation we talked about adding artificial light, and I didn't get into a lot of details as to exactly when to do that and how to, how often to do that. But typically, at a minimum, hens need 15 hours of day length or daylight in order to start to continue to lay. And so their natural cycle is, as the days are shorter, you'll start noticing a drop off in their production. And once it kind of drops below 14 hours of light per day, they'll usually quit laying. Some chicken owners are okay with that, and they just say that's the natural cycle and they're fine with it. Others do add artificial light. Usually it's better to add it in the mornings. And so you want to start having a light when the day length drops to 15 hours, or daylight, I should say, drops to 15 hours. You should start adding light. And so maybe just start with an hour or two in the morning. But, you know, I would say usually by mid-September, you should have some sort of artificial light if you want to keep your hens laying throughout the winter months. Another thing too, and this is always kind of disappointing to those of us who really like our chickens, but as chickens age, you'll notice a dramatic drop off in egg production too. And it's, you know, they're fairly short-lived. So, you know, young birds that are 2-3 years old kind of are at the prime of their production. And then as they pass year 3 and 4 and 5, they definitely start to decrease egg production. So that's just something else to keep in mind. Other questions, we had another question about keeping geese and chickens together. I have that, there's a lot of, just like I mentioned on the turkeys, there's a lot of variety in that. Some folks say that's not a good idea. I don't believe that there's any disease or health risk with keeping chickens and geese together like there is with chickens and turkeys. So I don't foresee that being a problem. I'd say it'd be more of just a management issue. Geese tend to be super hungry and they gobble everything. And so it may be a little challenging. There might just be gulping down the chicken food. I'm not sure. It probably depends on the setup, but I don't foresee that being a problem from a health standpoint. And yeah, I do think adding corn, I mentioned corn in the talk, and I do think for most poultry and waterfowl, you know, it's a nice option to have, and it'll just help kind of get them through the winter a little bit easier. There was another question about, do you need to bed the inside of poultry houses? And you don't necessarily have to. The bedding kind of provides a couple different functions. It helps keep things dry. So if you have a moisture problem in the house, then I would certainly add bedding to help absorb some of the that wet that's in the poultry manure. If you have a good setup where you're able to routinely collect the manure and it's not getting wet and it's not getting stinky, then I don't think you absolutely have to bed the house. So it's kind of up to you how you want to handle that. But the bedding just is to kind of absorb any liquid and to help with ammonia smell that you can sometimes get in poultry houses. Any other questions that you may have that I missed? Feel free to add them into the chat box now, or you're welcome to unmute yourself and speak up. And then I also just wanted to say with this final slide that Megan and I are available to make farm visits. We do this throughout the county. Again, all of our services are free of charge. It may take, you know, just give us a call, drop us an email, and we can try to set something up with you. Like while everyone's kind of reluctant to have us out during the winter because everything's a mess, trust me, we're used to seeing wet, mucky messes. And honestly, if you're having a drainage issue or you're having some problems with runoff and controlling kind of seasonal water on your property, call us out on the worst day. We have boots, we have rain gear. This is what we're used to doing. And I would, you know, encourage you as, you know, poultry managers, get out there on those really wet days too, because that's when you can really kind of see where you have problem areas and where you can really focus on addressing some fixes that we talked about. Any other questions? Okay, I'm not seeing anything coming else in the chat box. So I'll stick around here for a few minutes in case anybody else has anything. But again, thanks very much. We're going to make this recording available. We'll send you a link. We have your email. And I really appreciate you taking some time out of your evening and joining us. Okay, thank you.
Thanks everyone for joining us.